This time's protectionism is different. It aims at getting into global value chains, creating competitive private players. It's selective. And the earlier focus was very different. It was on self-sufficiency, protecting infant industries, and creating public sector champions. Critics argue that India is getting into a slippery slope. Such policies will have limited effectiveness in today's world, especially because exports are increasingly linked to imports. So such measures will ultimately hurt export competitiveness. The domestic market is not large enough to provide scale economies or grow globally competitive players. Instead, focusing on removing domestic bottlenecks would better serve the goals of integration and competitiveness. Today, Professor Subramanian will reflect on some of these issues, and I'm sure many more, and discuss about India in the new globalization. He'll speak for the next 10-15 minutes, and following that, the floor will be open to questions and comments from the audience. So without further ado, let me hand over the floor to Professor Subramanian. We look forward to hearing your views. Thank you.
Thank you to the Vista organizers of IIM Bangalore. Thank you, Professor Chanda, for inviting me. I also want to remind all of you that about 40 years ago, I was also a PGP student in one of the IIMs in India. And so I can, I hope, we can, touch some chords based on that as well. I'm delighted to be here speaking on this very important topic. I want to be brief because I want to, get your questions and, maybe try and respond to your questions. Let me first begin by giving a little bit of context to what's going on, a global context. Between, say, the mid-1980s and the global financial crisis, for about 25 years, give or take a few, the world saw two twin phenomena. I would say that was the golden age for developing countries in the international economic system. In that period, many, many more countries, notably China and India, but around the world, many developing countries finally started, catching up with standards of living in advanced economies. We call this convergence or catch up. It was like, so billions of, people in the poorer parts of the world finally could say, look, we can aspire to the standards of living in a way that hadn't happened. You had to go back to maybe 1600 or 1700 when China and India and Mexico and Peru were rich countries. After that, there was a long 400-year slide. And after 400-500 years, for the first time, we thought, developing countries could grow again. That period of convergence or catch-up was associated with a period that I called trade hyperglobalization. Essentially, many, many more goods and services started flowing across international borders. Capital flowed across international borders, ideas, technology, people. So it was the golden age also of globalization. So both the catching up and the globalization happened at the same time. And we have reason to believe that, globalization was a contributing factor to the sudden dynamism that we saw in many parts of the developing world. Of course, the case par excellence is, of course, China, which basically used trade, exports, and a foreign-oriented strategy to basically transform its economic fortunes. And so did India, and I'm going to come back to that. India also leveraged the world economy for about 25, 30 years. India did fantastically well based on this. Then after the global financial crisis, something happened around the world. We can go into it in detail later, but both politics and economics started turning populist, illiberal around the world. Many, many more checks on people's ability to speak up. Institutions, democratic institutions being undermined, identity politics rising all over the world. And this, this kind of toxic rise in political kind of nationalism and illiberalism was accompanied also with some, fading out of economic globalization. So, politics started turning inward, and so did economics. And around the world, you saw a much slower globalization, in fact, some deglobalization. The United States under Trump turned protectionist. China, in the last 4 or 5 years under Xi Jinping, has become much more inward oriented. The UK Brexit essentially also saying we want to be more, decide our own fate rather than have Europe deciding our fate. And I think in that broader global trajectory, India was not immune to that as well. India also started turning inward. And this is what Professor Chanda said, this Atmanirbhar Bharat became a big theme of Indian economic policy. So what did India do? I think that what has been striking about what has happened, I would say in the last 3-4 years in India, Atmanirbhar Bharat, what is striking is that since about the mid-80s, certainly after 1991, there was a consensus within India that the right way forward would be to open up gradually. India always does things gradually. We opened up steadily, slowly but steadily across the board, and there was a consensus around that. But what's happened in the last 3-4 years is that consensus at the level of ideas, forget about politics will always push you in the direction of kind of more protectionism, but because there was this ideological consensus that this is the right way forward, India was moving in that direction. But in the last 2-3 years, that consensus has been reversed, which is what is very striking. How does it manifest itself? Just to, for all of us to be clear, it's manifested itself mostly, I would say, in 3 forms, the inward turn. One is we've started erecting barriers to trade. Soumitra Chatterjee of Penn State and I have a paper which some of you could go and read, where we document how tariffs went up by quite a bit on many items. So India started saying, look, this is we're going to rely more on our domestic market for our growth strategy. So that's one manifestation. The second manifestation, and this Professor Chanda said, we've started to give subsidies, what were called PLIs, production-linked incentives. It's a kind of industrial policy strategy, trying to pick winners, giving them financial support, and hoping that somehow miraculously they will engine and grow and become very dynamic. The third component, which I think is very, very important, is that India has chosen very consciously to stay out of trade agreements, especially in Asia. There's a very big trade agreement in Asia called RCEP. China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, ASEAN, everyone is part of that. The only, of course, Europe is not part of it, but India is not part of it either. And India chose consciously not to be part of it. So that's also a sign of, kind of turning inward. And so these are the manifestations of that. Now, you have to ask the question, why? I mean, after all, we have very intelligent, smart policymakers, especially after I left, the smartness of policymakers has gone up. So the question is, why is that happening? And I think it's happening because of, 3 misconceptions. We think we're a big market. So we think that, why do we need the global market? We can do it based on our domestic market. But that is actually completely wrong. We may have, a reasonably big GDP, but in terms of a consuming market, even if you compare with China, we're about 20% of the size of China, 1/5. So we're still, and compared to the global market, we're just a fraction of the global market. So there's no. The second reason why I think this is happening is that we have kind of misread our own history. If you look at the papers of the last 3-4 years and all the economic commentary, it's always about, India is based on consumption. Consumption will drive growth. And, and so consumption is going up, consumption is going down. We're obsessed with consumption. In fact, what Soumitra and I show is that since about 1985, our growth, which has been so strong for about 25, 30 years, has been based on trade and exports. So we're kind of forgetting our own experience, our own lessons. In fact, the striking number we show is that since 1985, the third fastest manufacturing export growth, manufacturing, not even services, manufacturing export growth, we've been the third fastest after China and Vietnam, which is saying something. So it's like suddenly we've kind of lost sight of the fact that it's been trade and exports that drove our growth, but we've forgotten that lesson and we want to focus on our domestic market. The third reason I think is that there is a genuine concern, and as I said that if the world is deglobalizing, maybe we should also start turning inwards because we won't have enough opportunities to export and so on. So my view on this is that all of these are misguided, wrong, and will actually not help us exploit the world opportunities provided by the world. So just to give you one example, right? So what if the world is deglobalizing? We are still small enough that even if the world market shrinks, we can occupy more of that, provided we are competitive. So, which kind of brings me to the point that was raised by Professor Chanda, which is that we calculate that after the global financial crisis, China vacated space in the export market of about $150 billion. So basically, China's wages were rising. It was moving into higher skill categories, and whatever it was not doing in terms of exports, about 150 billion, very little was coming to India. It was going mostly to Vietnam, Bangladesh, a bit to Ethiopia, and we were not exploiting these opportunities. Last point, and two last points. One is a fact and one a kind of policy conclusion. The fact is that even though our exports have done very, very well, both in terms of manufacturing and services, our exports of less skill intensive products have not done as well. So we have a chart which Soumitra and I call our killer chart. If you compare India's share of the global labor force and China's share of the global labor force, and you kind of trade theory, and this Professor Chanda knows this better than all of us, that trade theory tells us that, if you have, kind of 20% of the global labor force, I mean, roughly you should be exporting something like that in terms of unskilled labor exports. It turns out that China is exporting, much more than its share of the global labor force, and we are exporting much less. So if we have an Achilles heel, it is low skill, essentially textiles, clothing, leather, footwear, toys, all these lesser, things that require less skill. We should be occupying much more space than we should. The last point I will say is that the problem with Atmanirbharta and what we're doing is that, think of it this way, China is vacating space, the world is deglobalizing, everyone says we need to be part of global value chains, right? But how do you become part of global value chains? You become by becoming more open, having fewer restrictions, because all of you, one thing is that don't get mystified by global value chains. It sounds very kind of, oh my God, global value chain. It's like a global value chain. Essentially, it means something very simple, that compared to the past, say you had to produce one unit, you needed to get, say, half a unit from the world, and you probably did it once or twice. The new global value chain basically means that inputs and outputs keep going in and out of borders many more times. That's why your restrictions at the border, whether it's tariffs, whether it's procedures, they need to be much more open and flexible. That's what it requires to become part of global value chains. So if you're going to impose more tariffs, if at the same time remember, there is an Asian global value chain centered around China, Japan, South Korea. And by choosing to stay out of this trade agreement, we are actually, foregoing, actually de facto saying, we don't want to be part of these value chains because we're opting out, because we're raising our barriers, and that's going to make the task much more difficult. So more broadly, I think that we should aim at self-confidence rather than self-reliance, and integrate much more, because otherwise, the risks of us losing out of global opportunities. Because let me end on let me say one thing. If India has to grow at 8, 9, 10%, as opposed to 3-4%, it needs rapid growth in exports and imports. No country in the world, no developing country in the last 50 to 75 years has grown rapidly without having a rapid growth in exports and trade. And no country can grow based on its domestic market alone. You can grow at 3-4% based on a domestic market, but you can't grow 8-9%, which is what India needs very badly to create the jobs for India's vast, unskilled, uneducated labor force. So the challenges ahead, I think all of you PGP students are going to be part of this, but you're going to be part of India's more educated, talented globalization. I mean, you're all going to be part of globalization, but at the very top of the skill spectrum. And as you go out, don't forget that India's dynamism requires all of India's labor force, not just the elite and talented, to be part of this globalization process and to benefit from it. Let me stop there and take questions.
Thanks a lot. So let me just start off with one question. You talked about the $150 billion space that's been vacated in the sort of labor-intensive manufacturing segment. So what has prevented India from exploiting this opportunity, apart from, fine, we understand about the higher barriers, the protectionism, etc. But what is the whole set of domestic factors, you would say, or which are the most important obstacles in preventing us from exploiting this?
See, I think that it's a very good question. And remember that the problem of India not exporting lower skilled products is not a post-global financial crisis problem. It's like a 25, 30-year-old problem, right? And so, everyone has his explanation of, why this has been the case, why. But clearly it has had to do with our, 25, 30-year-old strategy, which, Professors Bhagwati and Srinivasan and others have written a lot about. I would say among the many factors, the cost of doing business in India very high. Traditionally we've been very inward oriented. But I think above all, I would say that we've never really believed or facilitated or believed in size. We've always wanted to favor the small over the big. And we know that exporting, at scale like China does requires, big plants. The process of small companies becoming big companies is where you get the dynamism and the employment growth and the export growth and the productivity increase and so on. So we've always been very severe on size and on becoming big, whether it's our labor laws, whether it's our, all kinds of, tax laws, our anti-com, and of course, above all, our mindset that, we don't like big stuff. And unless we kind of get over that, I think we have a problem. And also, I think that, what you learn from the East Asian experience is that finally, maybe it doesn't matter that we're more protectionist, less protectionist. What the East Asians showed is that as long as you can have, whether if the government is able to help, but it can provide its help and ensure that firms are disciplined in being able to export, i.e., if they don't export, the state comes down and says, we withdraw whatever incentives we're giving you. I think that is going to be that mentality that we should have of forcing, having exporting discipline. That I think is going to be very important.
So that takes me to another question. If, thinking big or thinking of scale in a different way, the mindset has to shift. What is the role of MSMEs then you see in this new sort of order?
I think world over, MSMEs, essentially, being small means you're going to be unproductive, basically. So the glorification of MSMEs, it happens because, again, we like small, they employ a lot of people. But if they're going to be unproductive and less efficient, then it's going to be a problem. So I think the most efficient way of thinking about, one way of thinking about MSMEs is that they have to be plugged into, the exporting ecosphere. That in turn is very dynamic, and so being input suppliers to very dynamic firms, that's what keeps them nimble and productive and so on. So we don't want MSMEs to remain small, because that's not a recipe for productivity growth and export growth.
So what then needs to be the sort of push that government has to give, or in terms of the changes in the enabling environment, so that MSMEs get plugged into these global value chains or regional value chains, up their standards, upgrade their technology, and so on? We know what are the classic constraints that MSMEs face in India. What would be that set of things that the government could do? What could industry chambers do? I mean, how do we facilitate this process?
See, I think that if we have the basic export dynamism, I think industry will kind of figure its ways out of how to do their own internal supply chain, as it were. Right? You have an international supply chain, you have a domestic supply chain. So I think that that is clearly, I think, making credit available, for example. Making, for example, Manish Sabharwal in Bangalore says that, the labor Raj is very intrusive, for example, and that hurts small and medium enterprises much more. So maybe it's just things like, making credit available, not being harassing small and medium firms through all kinds of regulatory burdens. Maybe these are things that can be targeted at these MSMEs. But then rely on the broader dynamism of the, if you have a dynamic economy, exporting economy, then I think some of these supply chains will kind of develop naturally. I think it also has to be said that, in the last 2-3 years, the MSME sector faced two, pretty big shocks, right? Demonetization and GST. I think, GST was in some ways, that was a one-off shock, but the hope is, and I think if you look at revenues picking up, the hope is that, once they become part of the formal sector, having paid a kind of one-off cost of formalization, they will then, start reaping the benefits of being formal, and then benefit from, bigger firms wanting to interact with them because they are part of the formal chain.
So let me ask another question. You referred to our withdrawal from RCEP. Now, there's been a lot of discussion in recent years regarding our FTAs and that we haven't benefited. Some say, yes, we have, but you have to look at it differently, etc. So in your view, do you think that we have actually leveraged our FTAs, or is there a problem in the way we've designed the FTAs? Where is the issue really? Because from my own perspective, looking just at trade balances and FTAs is not the right way. However, I mean, from your perspective, what would RCEP have given us, which was over and above what we have got in other FTAs? Of course, the regional value chain and all, I understand that part of it. But do you think we could have leveraged it better than the others? Because we've not been able to do that with our existing bilaterals and so on.
Firstly, I think we've been very reluctant, even our FTAs. There's a term used called Swiss cheese FTAs. People call our FTAs Swiss cheese. And to explain to the audience, essentially in a free trade agreement, two countries come together and say they will eliminate all the barriers to trade amongst themselves, right? But in the case of India, we do the reduction of barrier in a kind of half-hearted way. We say, we'll leave out some products, we'll only do some products. Then we say, no, others will do it in 5 years, we'll do it in 20 years. So I think we've never really kind of embraced, FTAs as genuine opening mechanisms, right? I think that's been a problem. Now, in terms of this RCEP, I think that the supply chain part is critical. But the other part that's critical is that when others are integrating amongst themselves and we are left out, that means our export opportunities are going to be less. I mean, we are going to be at a disadvantage relative to others who are opening up amongst themselves. And that is happening vis-a-vis a market that's the most dynamic in the world. If, for example, two small countries got together and left out India, who cares, right? But, these are big countries, dynamic countries, ASEAN, China, Vietnam, they're all getting together, they're all dynamic, and our firms will be at a disadvantage. So that's a huge cost as well.
But in today's world, I mean, trade doesn't go single-handedly. It goes along with investments. And if you're not able to improve the business environment, the ease of doing business and attract these investments, which we haven't been to the extent, say, the Vietnams have been able to do, from Japan, Korea, etc. What would have been different then in the RCEP that we would have been able to bring in that investment, link it with the trade flows and so on?
So I think here we have to look. It requires a lot of things to do this, right? I mean, no one thing is going to get you. But by not being part of it, you've kind of, that's it. That's kind of like a necessary condition for being part of that. You're absolutely right. In addition, you have to do, attracting FDI, giving investors certainty. And of course, therefore, the action yesterday, which has been hanging for a long time, I think is a very welcome development. So, because, we've created a lot of investor uncertainty. So you have to do a lot of things. And so, just being part of this is no guarantee, but being not part of it, the odds are tilted against you considerably. You just make life more difficult for yourself.
Does it make sense? Many people are arguing that, okay, instead of the look east, now start looking west. Look at EU again, look at the UK after Brexit, look at Canada, look at these other partners, because that's where we will have more of a cost advantage. What is your take on this new shift from the look east, act east to look west now?
Yeah, I have two responses to that. Remember that, wherever you look, west, east, north, south, first you have to look at yourself. If domestically your tariffs are going to go up, you can neither look anywhere in the world. Nobody's going to say, come and join us, but you keep your tariffs high and raise your tariffs. By definition, when people say we want to be partners, they want you to open your market, not close your market. So by definition, we have to believe that we should be more open across the board. And that makes possible all these other things. But because if that's not there, if you're going to start raising tariffs, whatever, that's going to make it very difficult. Second, yeah, I mean, I kind of understand why we had this reticence about, essentially the reason we're not part of RCEP, basically it can be summarized in one word, which is China, right? Yeah. So, and I think there's a good. Not good, but there are arguments to be made why one should not engage with China or whatever, right? For political reasons, strategic reasons, economic reasons. But then you face the huge costs of those, and you have to be willing to pay those costs. So is turning west a kind of counterbalancing thing? To some extent, it is, yes. And therefore, turning west is not a bad option. When I was in government, we were looking at negotiating free trade agreements with the European Union. I think it's now reviving to some extent. I think that's a good thing, if it happens. But it's not going to happen if fundamentally we want to remain closed or, start erecting more barriers.
Yeah. And I guess the issues would be far more contentious in many senses regarding, standards and data protection, etc. I think these are harder markets compared to perhaps ASEAN and so on. Let me ask a few questions which have come from the audience. What are the probable impediments in the way of India becoming a $5 trillion economy by 2025? What policy interventions would help our country become a member of the $1 trillion club?
Trillion, we're already part of the $1 trillion club.
$5 trillion economy. I think that's the main question. What are the main challenges?
I think we need to have 2-3 Vista sessions to answer that question of, how India. Look, there's no one thing that needs to be done, right? I mean, you can't say do this, that, or the other. I think for about 30 years, we've found a formula for, having very rapid growth. In the last 10 years, we've lost that for some reason. It has to do with policies. It has to do with our, the ideological consensus. It has to do with the way the world has evolved. And I think that, I would, recommend a piece that, my friend Josh Feldman and I did 6 months ago. I think the broader software of economic policy making has to be, improved considerably. What that means is, so it's not any one thing that needs to be done. It's policy consistency. So if you want to attract investment, then, you can't have retroactive taxation, for example, right? If you want to help agriculture, then at the first sign of prices rising, you can't impose export controls that will reduce the benefit. So you need to be kind of consistent in your policies. I think that, we also need to have good data integrity to run economic policy. We need to be, the GST showed, and I was involved in the goods and services tax. The GST showed that India today cannot be run either at the center or at the states, and we need the center and the states to come together, to do any kind of, you take agriculture, you take power, you take any sector, neither the center nor the states can do it themselves. So I think to create an atmosphere where the center and the states trust each other and can work together, I think that's a big part of having good economic policies going forward. So I'm almost saying that the process of policy making is as important as any one thing in terms of what you need to do, like agriculture or tariffs or doing business or whatever. So it's a much broader thing that needs to happen.
We have another question which is specific to the automobile industry. India is opening up its automobile industry to foreign players, the most recent one being the US EV giant Tesla, opening up its manufacturing hub in Bangalore. What are the near and medium-term ramifications of this?
I don't know enough about the automotive industry, so I don't want to, I certainly don't know what's happening on the EV. Look, all I do know is that one of India's greatest successes of globalization was, in fact, our auto, especially the auto parts industry. There's a hub around Chennai that since the maybe the mid to late 1990s did very, very well. And I think it's a model to study why India did so well, and especially Tamil Nadu did so well in terms of creating this globally competitive. It's not a hub that's based on catering to the domestic market. It's a globally competitive hub, and we really so many auto manufacturers came to do that. But in fact, last few years, what I've seen is that auto companies leaving India rather than staying on in India. So if Tesla is coming in, I think it's a wonderful sign. It's a good sign, but I don't know enough about whether that is a one-off or whether that is something that really means that our auto ecosystem is becoming much more competitive and dynamic. I just don't know enough.
Let me come back to something you had mentioned earlier, the example of East Asia, and how perhaps I think what you were alluding to is the selection of sort of winner industries in some sense. There was, so do you think if we were to try and nurture certain industries, thinking of something like the Porter framework, will our political process, the way we function, center state, all these issues, will it be good enough to really be able to identify?
See, I actually worry about almost the exact problem. So, I've often been, quoted as saying, if you want to think about India over the last 40 years, 50 years, I say kind of a little bit glibly that India went from socialism without entry to capitalism without exit. So exit in India is very, very difficult. You take the banking sector problems in India, exit is very difficult. There are all these, bad loans, companies not doing well, and we're just not able to find our way out of it. Similarly, you take Air India, we're not able to find our way out of it. Take all the subsidies we have, very difficult to get out of farm subsidies, power subsidies, so on. So in some ways, the bigger worry about, the selective industrial policy is not that, because by definition in such a strategy like this works only if 95% companies fail. Otherwise, it's not a good strategy. No venture capitalist in the world, and the PGP student should know, if a venture capitalist comes and tells you my track record is 100% success, he is lying and he doesn't know what he's talking about, because by definition, it's a risky business, and by definition, risk means 95% will fail. So if that is what's going to happen, if things are going to fail, we've never had a good track record of letting things fail. And so, so if you're stuck with just, having to keep, subsidies more and more because we can't withdraw them, that's something I think one has to really worry about. So that's why I think it's tricky to think about this whole industrial policy, because both selecting winners and letting losers fail are both, I think, whether the government has the ability to do that, I just don't know. I certainly don't have faith in any Indian government's ability to allow exit, to allow bad companies to fail.
One last question before we close, which is on the digital economy, because you're talking of India in the new globalization. What sort of prospects? What is your outlook regarding India's digital trade, whether services, goods? How do you see us positioned?
Very bullish. I think, the Indian IT, for example, I'm told that Bengaluru has become the app capital of the world, app making capital of the world. So I think on that score, see, the reason I'm optimistic for two reasons. One is Indian capability here is, because even if you look at the last 4 or 5 years, you've had all these what are called acorn companies, a lot of them using technology, and whether it's finance and technology and finance, technology and consumer goods, technology and things. I think we've become very good at that, I think. And the other reason I'm optimistic is that if you look at the world, I began by saying the world is kind of deglobalizing or not globalizing fast enough. What I didn't say was that is true for trade in goods. If you look at trade in services, actually the world continues to globalize. So the opportunities will be rising, increasing globally, and we seem to be well positioned because of our talent and our track record of the last 30 years. And it's fitting that we should be talking about this in Bangalore, because I think the possibilities are quite tremendous based on the performance of Bangalore and the broader IT ecosphere in India.
Thanks. Yeah, but I think we need to also figure out what we want to do with data protection laws, e-commerce, and so on. We're sort of sitting on the fence on these issues. So the world requires us to be on the stage with them, negotiating these things, and we're staying away. So thanks a lot. I think we've covered quite a gamut of issues concerning the global world order, the domestic economy, the challenges that we are facing, and clearly, there's no set sort of recipe for how we integrate, how we become more competitive. It's really an ecosystem that we have to create. So thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to listen to you, and thanks for your insights. So I hand it over to the Vista team.
Thanks a lot, Professor, for answering all the questions patiently. That was definitely insightful. So as we close this session, on behalf of Team Vista, I extend my gratitude to Professor Subramanian for taking out time from his busy schedule to grace the event. Today's session about the Indian economy and its path towards globalization was full of knowledge and interesting things. The three reasons that Professor Subramanian highlighted for India turning inwards, which were assuming that we are a big domestic market, obsession with consumption-led growth, when in fact our growth was historically based on trade and exports, and the general perception of deglobalization were really informative. Also, the fact that India has to rapidly increase its exports and imports rather than turn inwards, while at the same time taking MSMEs along if it has to grow at high rates, was also really insightful. Thank you so much, Professor. As a small token of our gratitude, we have made a contribution to Enrich Life's Foundation in your name. The contribution has helped serve 3 square meals to 10 children impacted adversely by COVID-19. I would also like to thank Professor Chanda for providing us immense support in organizing and making this session a success. I would like to thank everyone for attending today's knowledgeable session. I am sure that there would have been a lot to learn.